This super scale, budget-priced hardbody rig has tons of potential, so without breaking the bank, here's what I did to make it even better. Hello everyone and welcome. In today's video, I've got the FMS FJ40 back on the bench. I had the opportunity to review this rig a few months ago, and while I was overall very impressed with this truck, I did have a few critiques. Of course, for more on my thoughts on this truck and to learn more about it, feel free to check out the prior review video, which I will post a link to below in the description. In short, this truck is awesome and it looks amazing, especially for the price. That said though, I think there are a few elements that detract both from the appearance and the driving experience of this rig. I will be addressing these shortcomings and showing how just a few simple and inexpensive parts can take this truck from good to great.
Alright, I am super excited to have the FJ40 back on the bench. I know FMS's latest release, the FCX10 K5 Blazer, has really taken the spotlight, and for good reason. That is a phenomenal rig, and I've got some new parts coming for that, so certainly stay tuned. But for the die-hard scale enthusiasts, this Land Cruiser is one awesome rig. Now of course this one here is in a slight state of disassembly, but you get the idea. Certainly the selling point of this rig is the detailed hardbody. Both the exterior and the interior of this truck have a phenomenal amount of detail. Really about the same amount of detail that we love and expect from the plastic model kits used for our custom RC builds is present here in larger scale, fully painted and ready to run. So unlike the new FCX10 platform, the one found under this Toyota is a lot more basic. Four-wheel drive with both locked diffs front and rear, multi-link suspension, chassis-mounted servo, front-mounted motor sending power to a divorce transfer case. No bells and whistles, nothing fancy, mechanically very simple. Some might actually see that as an advantage over the FCX10. Regardless, it's everything you need to do some RC off-roading. There's a lot to like with this truck, but as I mentioned during that prior review video, this vehicle does have a few shortcomings. Now I'm not going to be going all out with this project by tearing this thing completely down and adding a bunch of detail and spending hundreds on parts. I'm just going to make a few strategic enhancements to a few areas of this vehicle that I think are lacking. There's a few mods on these trucks that I think any owner should consider doing. The first being a metal servo arm upgrade. Again, I talked about this during that prior review video. The stock plastic servo arm that was found on the Rock Hobby Michigan, which utilizes a basically identical chassis design, failed pretty early on. While the plastic servo arm that came stock on this truck didn't fail, the fastener that held it to the servo did come out. I figured while I was working on it, why not just go ahead and install a new metal servo arm. It fits well, it's solid, and with some thread lock on that fastener holding it onto the servo, it should be good to go. Now, like with a lot of ready-to-run trucks, the stock steering servo is not the best. I think for general trail driving though, it should definitely be sufficient. I did end up upgrading the steering servo on my Rock Hobby Michigan. I think I'll run the stock servo for a while and maybe down the road I'll swap it out. The next mod that I think is an absolute must for these trucks is to upgrade the ESC. Among other things, the drag brake on this truck is way too strong and very touchy. So I, like many others, am going to be upgrading it to a Hobby Wing 1080. This here is a 1080 G2, which has a few new features not seen on the prior version. One of those features is by plugging this into an auxiliary port on the receiver, you can adjust the amount of drag brake from your transmitter. A cool feature that's seen stock on the FCX10, so it'll be cool to add that to this vehicle as well. It's a nice feature as you can turn the drag brake down or even off entirely if you're just trail driving and want the truck to coast. Then if you want to do some crawling, you can crank it up so the truck will hold its position when you're ascending or descending over an obstacle. The other feature that I think will be cool to try out, and if I'm understanding this correctly, I believe it's called real car mode. It makes your trigger only do throttle and brake. You don't reverse from the trigger. Instead, you shift via a switch like this or a button. So with this setup, if I wanted to go forward, I could flip this switch, I'd have gas and brake, and I could brake as much as I want, it won't reverse. And if I want to go in reverse, I would shift into reverse, then give it a bit of gas. Basically more like a real car. You're shifting between forward and reverse rather than doing everything from the throttle trigger. I don't think that would make much sense for like a comp crawler, but for a trail rig like this, I think that could be pretty cool. Both of those functions are optional and you can plug those into auxiliary ports on your receiver. To enable all those features, I am going to be swapping out the receiver in addition to the ESC on this truck. This is a R7 FG from Radiolink, which I will be pairing to my RC6GS transmitter. From the factory, it looks like they give you a 4-channel receiver with one of those slots sending power to the headlights. You could use the stock receiver with this 1080 G2 if you wanted to, but I don't think you'll be able to utilize all of its functions. I have an extra receiver on hand, so I'm going to be swapping it out, but it is completely optional. Just putting in a 1080 is going to be a huge improvement over what you have stock. I think this new version of the 1080 sells for somewhere between $40 and $50. You might be able to find the prior version of the 1080 for a little cheaper. It does lack the on-the-fly drag brake adjustment and that real car mode, but if those aren't important to you, you can save a few bucks, as otherwise it's essentially the same thing. Keyword there being essentially. I'm sure there's some other improvements. I think the footprint is a little bit different on the G2, but functionally either one will work just fine in this vehicle. A good thing to have with these ESCs is a programming card. This will let you adjust various parameters. Way easier to use a programming card than to hit a button and wait for beeps. I believe you do have to purchase these now separately. I think they're like $7 to $10. If you've got one of the older programming cards from the prior versions of the 1080, it should work with the G2, but I can't say for certain. This is an extremely popular ESC. There's tons of information out there. Certainly if you want to learn more about the 1080, I'm sure there are a plethora of great videos from fellow content creators here on YouTube. The next mod, which is certainly less essential, but it's still something I think a lot of people will want to do, and that's change out the wheels. Obviously, the wheel design is subjective, but in my opinion, I think it detracts from the overall very scale and vintage appearance of this beautiful Land Cruiser body. I've gone ahead and I've bought some really cheap 1.9 Steelies. These are made from injection molded plastic. They're not a beadlock style wheel. They came with some pretty nice looking tires that I thought would look good on this truck. I could probably get used to them, but I think I'm going to retain the stock tires and just mount them to these new wheels. The reason is that these new tires are just a bit smaller and don't really fill out the wheel well as much, and I'm not as big of a fan of the look. Really, this is probably way more accurate to the tire size that would be found stock on a real Land Cruiser of this era, but I'm going to go with the beefier set of tires, just a personal preference. I did notice that these are 5-lug wheels, and in the real world, this Land Cruiser would be a 6-lug. Despite that though, I still say this is a big upgrade over what it comes with stock. What I plan to do though is actually not install these bolts and nuts that you see here. They don't serve any purpose aside from appearance. What I'll do instead is 3D print a factory style hubcap that will go over top. Again, there's nothing wrong with what this truck comes with. It's just a matter of opinion, what you think looks best. Something you'll want to check on these trucks is to make sure there's grease in both the axles and the transfer case. I found there to be no grease in the axles, and I haven't checked the transfer case yet, but apparently a lot of other people who own these trucks found there to be either none or very little grease in either the axles or the transfer case. That's especially important if you're going to be doing a lot of driving through water or in mud. Really want to prevent corrosion on those internal components. Another thing, and again I pointed this out during that prior review video, but on the front suspension, these lower links come into contact with this part right here. The truck is losing some suspension travel since they're hitting these points right here. I believe these mounts would be used if you install the optional leaf springs. On this truck, I'm going to go ahead and retain the stock suspension though. Because of that, and to get every millimeter of travel that I can, I'm going to go ahead and cut these sections off. And no, these mounts are not separate parts that you can just take off. It appears these mounts, the motor mount, servo mount, front cross member is all just one molded plastic piece. Obviously, if you intend to install leaf springs or think you might in the future, don't cut those off. So these next two things aren't really mods, but when you get the trucks initially, they come with these little stickers that hold everything together. They like to leave behind residue. I'm sure there's a lot of good products for that, but this Goo Gone took it right off and doesn't harm the paint at all. And finally, as I'm sure every owner of these trucks has done, when you get these trucks, crank up the dual rate. That's going to increase the amount of steering angle. Now, obviously, in general, when you're adjusting your dual rate, you don't want to do it to the point where you're stressing out your steering servo or snapping a U-joint. But I and many others have cranked up the dual rate on these truck stock and have had zero issues. It gives the trucks a tighter turning radius and makes them more maneuverable. You can't unlock the diffs like you can on the FCX10, so these kind of need all the help they can get. Now obviously you could go all out with mods if you wanted to. This isn't the most upgradable chassis out there, but you can still put brass on it. You could put in better shocks, better motor, steering servo. You could spend hundreds if you wanted to. Nothing wrong with that, of course. I'm just looking to make it a bit better than stock, more enjoyable to drive, and a little better looking. If you want to run this truck bone stock, that's cool. If you want to go all out with mods, that's cool as well. These are just the items that I think will give me and many of you the most return for your time and money investment, if that makes sense. But certainly let me know what mods you've done or would recommend below in the comments if you own one of these FMS or Rock Hobby 10 scale rigs. Alright, enough talking at the bench though. As you could probably tell, I've already gotten started on a few things, so let's dive right in.
As mentioned, I ordered a set of inexpensive plastic non-beadlock 1/9 wheels and tires. Nothing amazing, but trust me, after a little paint and installing some hubcaps, they're going to look pretty sweet. After getting a few measurements, I started working on the hubcap design in Autodesk Fusion 360. In hindsight, I could have done something very similar to what I did with the Michigan. On that rig, what I did was disassemble the stock beadlock wheels and simply design and 3D print a new face piece which I could install in place of the stock one. I believe fellow RC channel Ampro Engineering is going to, if not already, has a design available that will fit in place of the stock wheel piece, so if that's of interest to you, certainly check out his channel. On this truck though, I'm just going to use a small amount of glue to hold the hubcaps in place. Not ideal, but it's a trail truck and it's not like I'm going to be swapping wheels on any sort of frequent basis. If a hubcap snaps when it's time to remove it, I'll just 3D print a new one. Certainly not the best setup, but not the end of the world either. Using reference images, I was able to come up with a design for both the front and rear that looked pretty similar to what you might find on the real thing. I found the website for the Land Cruiser Museum to be a great resource. They have tons of great photos of the Land Cruisers in their collection, which was great to use for reference. After confirming that the hubcap design will work with a FDM 3D printed prototype, I sent the files over to an SLA 3D printer for printing in resin. These will have a better surface finish, and they look awesome after a bit of sanding and some paint. The inner ring for the black sections of the hubcaps can be 3D printed separately using an FDM printer. Despite being molded in white, the wheels looked a lot better after some matte white paint. After the paint dried, I could install the tires using a bit of glue. The back spacing on these wheels is a little different than the stock ones, resulting in some new wheel hexes needing to be installed. I just 3D printed these, not the strongest option, but for a trail truck, they'll do just fine. The wheels fit nicely, although a little close for comfort on the front left corner. Unfortunately, there's no easy way for me to space these wheels out any further, but it'll work. A 3D scanner can be a great tool for helping to create custom parts. I recently had the chance to test out the new Moose 3D scanner from 3D Maker Pro. For more on that, check out my prior video. A great example of how these 3D scanners can be useful can be seen here by aiding in the creation of some custom inner fender pieces. After a dusting of some baking soda to help the dark colored chassis be more visible to the scanner, I was able to use that mesh to create some inner fenders. In hindsight, I could have spent a little more time on the scan as it's incomplete in a few sections, but regardless, it was a huge help. I designed these parts relatively quickly, trying to strike a balance of somewhat replicating the shape that would be found on a real Land Cruiser while allowing enough room for the larger than stock tires. I wanted to do my best to ensure the tires wouldn't rub even when the suspension is fully compressed. The finished results, while not perfect, looks a lot better than just being able to see right into the RC electronics under the hood. Another part I created with the help of a 3D scan was a grill insert for the hood. I have seen some people just cut this area out, but I thought since the pre-existing grille is just a solid piece, I'd match it with the upper section of the grille the best I could, and the result looks pretty nice. I was a little too cautious and made the piece smaller than it should be. I painted both that piece and this section of the hood matte black, so its smaller size is not so noticeable. If you're interested in the STL files for any of the parts that I've designed in this video, I'll be posting them on our Patreon page, which of course I'll be linking below in the description. I sprayed some paint onto the inner fenders. I was able to find what I thought was a pretty good match for the body. The cap looks close, but the parts themselves are darker, possibly because of the primer underneath. I wanted to try to match the inner fenders to the body since that's how it would be from the factory, though it would look good leaving them black as well. No additional hardware is required to install these. Just remove the 4 pre-existing fasteners and then reinstall them with the inner fenders in place. Despite the less than perfect color match, they still look pretty cool, definitely better than no inner fenders at all.
This Land Cruiser is already looking a lot better, but what I want to do now is use an airbrush and some paint to add a few details to this body, like painting the weather stripping. Unfortunately, quite a bit of masking is going to be required since I don't want to have to completely disassemble this body. In order to paint the weather stripping on the windshield, I will need to remove this piece. Otherwise, it's not really going to be practical to paint that upper section. From looking at the manual, I should be able to just remove 2 screws from the roof, and then this should just slide out.
Well, maybe a little easier said than done, but I got it out and could begin the very fun process of masking everything and carefully airbrushing some matte black paint.
I hate masking, but this part is kind of satisfying.
I'm no expert when it comes to painting these details, but I think the weather stripping looks a lot better, and so does the body overall. But I didn't stop there though. I also added a few details using a chrome pen and markers. Next, I watered down some black acrylic paint to sort of create a wash to fill some of the panel gaps and sort of smear over many areas of the body, particularly the lower sections and on the back. I wanted to try to give the truck a slightly grimy and dirty appearance, sort of dull down the gloss of that factory paint just a bit. It's very subtle, and I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of it gets rubbed or washed away over time, but I think dulling down the paint just a bit helps. I might go back again and try to accentuate some of the panel gaps just a little more, but I really want to let the trails do the majority of the weathering. FMS really did the heavy lifting with this truck, but still these little details do add to the overall appearance of this Land Cruiser, certainly well worth the effort. The real icing on the cake ended up being these awesome looking hubcaps. The paint on these turned out looking awesome, especially after adding a few additional details by hand. I used glue to hold them in place, and again, what a big improvement over the stock wheels. I much prefer this vintage OEM style look. I think it matches the rest of the truck so much better. I decided to paint the running boards on each side aluminum rather than leave them black. I just thought it might be cool to have them match the bumpers. I'm not worried about the paint scraping off, as it won't look bad if a little bit of the black plastic shows through. Like I said earlier, I did go ahead and remove those leaf spring mounts, which will go unused. I gained a little less travel than I thought I would, since the shocks actually bottom out not far beyond where they would have stopped before, but whatever, I maybe got a few more millimeters out of the front suspension.
So I've got the cosmetics of the truck finished up, at least as far as I want to go today. I've still got a few ideas of some things that would be fun to add, but already it's looking a lot better. All that's left to do now is what I hope will be the easy stuff, and that's swapping out the ESC and receiver. Obviously, I'm sure I'm going to have to adjust a few parameters on both the transmitter and the ESC. Aside from that though, it should be basically plug and play. Of course, if you don't have much experience with RC electronics, make sure that you have all the manuals handy. These should contain all the information that you'll need to get everything set up. Again, a programming card is a really nice tool to have for adjusting these 1080s. I think I'm going to throw a battery in and drive it around just a little bit with the stock electronics, and then we'll switch it over and see what difference it makes.
Hopefully this gives you a good idea of just how harsh that drag brake can be and how touchy the throttle is. I'm not trying to exaggerate it here, it really is pretty touchy and it's hard to drive the truck smooth. This is on 3S, and on 2S it wouldn't be quite as bad, but still, let's get this new ESC and receiver installed and see what difference it makes. Not the cleanest engine bay ever, but it's all in there. I'm using channel 3 to adjust the drag brake intensity and channel 5 to switch between forward and reverse. I just plugged everything in and everything worked as expected. A huge improvement. Of course, it's not going to be silky smooth with the stock brushed motor, and I haven't yet adjusted anything on the ESC aside from enabling the real car mode, but this truck is going to be a lot more enjoyable to drive. It's much smoother and has much better low speed control. The shifting between forward and reverse might take some getting used to, but I'm going to try it out for a while and see how it goes. Well, this Land Cruiser certainly looks good, so all that's left to do now is to get it out onto the trails. A great truck made even better. No surprise, I had a lot of fun out on the trails. Is there room for improvement? Absolutely. But just getting that new ESC put in really makes a huge difference and makes the truck more enjoyable to drive. Whether you already own one of these trucks or you're considering purchasing one, I hope you found this video informative and entertaining. That's going to be all for today's video, but as always, thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.